Hello students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS, IIT Roorkee. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course, Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. In today's lecture, we will discuss a case study which will sum up the discussions that we had in this entire week, particularly related to judicial activism, the public interest litigations, social movements, as well as what is happening in the courtroom as well as what is happening on the ground. Basically, we'll discuss politics of law and politics of the people. So let us start. In this lecture, while we are doing it, the particular case study we'll discuss about is called the Safe Chilika movement or Chilika Bachao Andolan. Now, Chilika Bachao Andolan happened in the early 90s, in which a mass of people in the Chilika Lake region of Odisha stood up against the Tatas, because the government of Odisha had given the lake or a portion of the lake on lease to the Tatas to build shrimp aquaculture farms or shrimp aquaculture ponds. Now, I am not using, or I will not be using the word ponds much, because the reason being that ponds are created in certain geographical locations, whereas in the context of Chilika, rather than creating ponds, enclosures were created, or enclosures are being created inside the lake itself, which are not earthen embankments, rather they are made up of nets or jalis. So let us begin with the historical background of this entire context. Now, Chilika Lake, as I said, is one of the largest brackish water lagoons in the world. Now, when I say it is one of the largest brackish water lagoons in the world, that means that it is spread over more than 1000 square kilometers. The length of this lake is more than 60 kilometers. At its widest point, it is more than 30 kilometers. Although it is this big, but it is considered to be a shallow lake, because the depth of this lake, particularly in the central area, so the lake can be identified in this pattern. This side is Bay of Bengal. This side you have the land mass. Here you have two sea mouths. This is the widest point between Satapada and western part of the lake, and this portion is considered as the breeding grounds as well as the nurturing grounds for exotic birds. Now, it is called brackish water because, as I said, you have two sea mouths. That means sea water or salt water from the sea enters the lake through these two channels. At the same time, there are numerous rivers and small streams that empty their waters in the lake. So, this portion is usually the sweet water, this portion is usually salt water, and this entire middle portion happens to be brackish water. During the monsoon season, when there is a lot more gusts of fresh water, this lake almost turns as a freshwater lake. Whereas during the summer season, when the inlet is less, then there is more of salt water in the lake, which turns it into more salty. And this is where the beauty of this lake lies. Its climatic condition, its ecological condition, it shifts from season to season, and almost 75% or 75 to 80% of all the fishery resources that are found inside the lake, they come from the Bay of Bengal. or they have their origins in the Bay of Bengal. At the same time, while a majority of this lake is shallow, which is almost like 3.5 to 4 feet deep, this portion happens to be a lot less shallower, or there is lot more depth here. It is a lot deeper in this zone also, because with the sea water and the gush at which it comes, it creates bigger entrenchments. Because of the creation of these bigger entrenchments, different kinds of people or different kind of fishing communities, they fish or they catch fish in different areas of the lake. So, different communities, when I mentioned, it means that fisheries in Chilika happens to be caste based occupation, and there are 7 dominant fishery jatis that are there, who call this lake their home, from where they have been getting their livelihood since generations. Now, what happens is that when something is caste based, and as I said, people had usufruct rights. Usufruct rights means they had use rights. Nobody actually owned this lake. Before independence, the lake came under the sovereign control of the Raja, who lived here in these islands called Malud Island, whereas during the British period, the lake came under their jurisdiction. But more interesting than that is that when somebody has usufruct rights, then they also consider it as a commons or a common pool resource. And when it's a common pool resource, that means anybody and everybody has a right to enter it to gain a livelihood if they have certain kind of rights. Now, let me explain. When I say certain kind of rights and when I say common pool resources, the general conception is that common pool resources mean anybody can enter here, which is not the case. When it is a common pool resource or a common property resource, that means there are specific rules and regulations that have been created by the community itself to access certain areas of the lake. Now, one caste group or one jati among the fishing community, they have one specific zone, one specific craft to capture fish. So, somebody would lay traps, somebody would use nets, somebody would use boats and nets. So, this is a way through which most often than not any kind of resource conflict is minimized, because every village, more than 100 villages are there in and around the lake. So, each one of these villages and caste groups had specific areas and zones where they can enter and do the activity. So, what happened when shrimp became known, or shrimp from Chilika became known worldwide? The government of Odisha in the 1960s and 1970s and then also in the 1980s felt that the fishing communities are not using the lake properly and efficiently, and they are not being productive. When the government of Odisha claimed the fishing communities not to be productive, that means who can be productive? Corporate houses. And in eastern part of India, whether it is Jharkhand, whether it is West Bengal or it is Odisha, the Tatas happen to be one of the biggest players. And what did the Tatas do? They came, they said, okay, we will open give us some area of the lake, we will create a specific company, and this company will produce shrimp in this lake, and we will export them to Japan, to the European Union and to Northern America, through which we are going to get dollars. And dollars in the pre-liberalization period, anybody who promised government of Odisha or government of India that they are going to get those green currency notes, the governments are more than happy to deliver to them. Now, shrimp are bottom dwellers. Bottom dwellers means that if this is the surface and this is the bottom, fish usually move in between. Dolphins, being mammals, they swim in between, then they come out, then again go inside. Whereas the crustaceans, of which family are the shrimps, they are bottom dwellers, they are scavengers. So they live at the bottom, and they usually live in shallow waters where the flow of water is not so high. Because if the flow of water is high, then they cannot reside in these areas, and the flow of water would not be high. Shallow, it will be shallow in the bank areas of the lake, particularly those areas where the quality of water is also of a certain pH value. So in an effect, if this is Satapada, this is the sea mouth area, this entire zone was given to the Tatars. Now when Tatars got it, several caste groups not only lost access to those places, even women lost access to these places, because in fishing communities, particularly in the case of Chilika, women are not allowed, historically and culturally they are not allowed to row boats. So they would go to this bank areas, and then when they go to the lake's banks, that is the place from where they can collect their fish and shrimps. So when this land was given, or the land or water was given to the Tatars, a great majority of these communities lost their access to the lake. So what happens after that? As we discussed in the previous classes, in the post-emergency period, judicial activism was at its peak, particularly in the 1980s and early 1990s, in which judges of Supreme Court of India as well as high courts of different states, they wanted to think through social actions and also wanted to become the guardians of the marginalized, shaping expectations among citizens and activists seeking justice. So when the movement started, Chilika Bachao Andolan as a movement started, civil society organizations came to fore. They mobilized, they kind of built consciousness among different kinds of people in and outside of the lake area, so that there could be issues of livelihood claims, environmental justice and constitutional rights that can be addressed. Now, while street level protests were going on, certain NGOs, particularly coming from these civil society organizations, they went and filed cases in the High Court of Odisha. And they not only did that, a few others went and filed a Public Interest Litigation or PIL in the Supreme Court of India. And in the Supreme Court of India, particularly in the case of Jagannathan versus Government of India, the Supreme Court of India took issue with the environmental discourse. It argued that coastal regulation zone, or within the framework of coastal regulation zone, any water body, whether it is a lake or a lagoon, or it happens to be the sea or an ocean, up to 500 meters from the coast, you cannot have any large scale infrastructural projects, including construction of certain embankments for commercial purposes or even aquaculture. So what did it do? In the name of coastal regulation zone and pollution principles, it banned aquaculture in ecologically fragile water bodies. So it did in Chilika, it did in the Pulicat Lake. Pulicat Lake is another lagoon that is at the border of Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. Same kind of situation was happening there also. Now, when it did so, it again created an exception for Chilika and Pulicat lakes, that unlike coastal regulation zone where it was 500 meters from the coast, in this case it was 1000 meter or 1 kilometer from the coast, where you cannot have this kind of installations. But what it also did is that it said, okay, while we cannot have commercial activities going on, what we can have is we allow traditional extensive shrimp cultivation. Now, when we speak about traditional extensive shrimp cultivation, we don't know what it is. Is it related to the way fishing communities used to do it before or capture the shrimps? Because when you say shrimp cultivation, it is not capturing. A cultivation happens like we do agriculture. It's a very different form. Whereas when it is capturing, that means the animals are already there, you go and capture them. Like we have captured fisheries. Cultivation means you create an embankment, you create a pond, you create a gheri, and within that gheri, you cannot allow anything to move out or move in. When you cannot allow anything to move out or move in, that means that you have those animals inside of this. You provide them with food, you provide them with different other nutrients so that they can survive there. Now, interestingly, when Supreme Court spoke about environmental discourse, it forgot that such environmental framings do not speak the language of class and caste relationships. Because in Chilika, like in many other places, in the 1970s and 1980s, when the shrimp cultivation as well as fish from Chilika became known worldwide and export potential was identified, non-fishing caste people, particularly the jatis like Brahmin, jatis like Karan, which are otherwise called as Kayast, and Khandayats, they also entered the lake as the fishing community to capture fishes as well as to have these pen enclosures for the cultivation of shrimp. So, when class and caste relations were ignored, it gave rise to newer problems. And one of the biggest problems was incoming of non-fishing communities and filing PILs in the Odisha High Court. Now, Odisha High Court understood it in a very different way than that of the Supreme Court of India, because Supreme Court of India had understood it as the right to life in terms of environment. Here it understood the right to, the Odisha High Court understood or interpreted the entire discourse as right to life of the non-fisher caste groups, that even the non-fisher caste groups had been living in those areas of the lake since generations, and for their daily consumption they also used to catch fish and shrimps. But what is interesting here is that it understood, or the High Court understood, the right to life as a constitutional guarantee. And if non-fishing caste groups are not allowed to enter the lake to capture fish, that means the right to life is being hampered. That means the fundamental right is being hampered. So it reversed the order of course it cannot completely reverse the order of Supreme Court's verdict, but it gave a leeway to the non-fishing communities to access the lake and do whatever they want to. So in a way, these two verdicts created or deepened intra-community tensions and weakened collective mobilization. The ground reality which emerged in the post-1996 period, in the year in which Jagannathan versus Government of India verdict of Supreme Court came out was that the PFCS or Primary Fishermen Cooperative Societies witnessed that now they have land, now they have water, but they do not have the resources to invest there, because investing in these pen enclosures is not easy, and maintenance of these pen enclosures is also not easy. So what they understood was that while the government of Odisha would lease out these areas to this PFCS, they would illegally sublease this land or sublet these lands and water areas to private investors, and these private investors would eventually gain. Now let me come to the actual problem here. The actual problem is that we saw what happened in the Supreme Court of India, we witnessed what happened in the High Court of Odisha, and we witnessed what happened before that when there was mass mobilization. But I have not spoken as of now a very crucial agent, and this agent was the shrimp mafia. Now this shrimp mafia, according to popular legend, could be bureaucrats, could be political leaders, could even be the exporters, as well as very powerful and influential groups. So in essence, what we see here is that there is a great deal of contradiction of what is happening on paper and how judicial activism cannot completely nullify the various class, caste, gender and other kind of issues on the ground. Police actions, so let me give you a scenario. There is a word PFCS or an NGO has gone to the High Court of Odisha. You see there is certain illegal shrimp enclosures in the lake and nothing is being done. So it will give a verdict saying that remove them. Police would come with its entire the bandobast and they would flatten a few enclosures. Media houses will be there, they will take a lot of photographs the entire day. The story will run on every news channel. The next day you get photographs and news items in newspapers. But by the end of the day, everything is back to their places, because the pen enclosures that are created, they are not created for the actual mafia groups, but they are created for the small business people there. And interestingly, because these are scavengers, shrimps are scavengers, they do not move around during daytime. So by evening, the enclosures are back into the installation, and inside of that, shrimps are happily roaming around. So there is a systematic kind of disposition that happened because of the preservation of certain kind of the constitutional governance. And the shrimp cultivation and its political economy, it's again interesting because everything is being done so here we see that there are a lot of very powerful people who are in cahoots with the PFCS in order to continue this hybridity of legal illegal systems. So these legal illegalities create an ecosystem in which whatever is done, it is done at a superficial level and nothing really works. So as I said, this has given rise to something called a regime of blame avoidance. So that is my term, regime of blame avoidance, because now everybody is passing the buck in this circle. Police is passing the buck because they say that they do not have enough force. Then you go to the High Court or Supreme Court will pass a verdict, let it be done. It will come back to the Chilika Development Authority and the Tehsildar to get the work done. They will say, okay, we can do much, but yes, we will go and flatten some of them, we remove some of those areas. Then in the morning, you go back that the gheris are back, and then again the same problems begins. So everybody is just passing the buck. Nobody is really interested in looking at what is happening there. So social movements and neoliberal governance are a very fancy combination of success and failure. What looks like success in terms of social movement and judicial activism at one point could look as a failure after a few years. So while legal routes create predictable channels through which dissent is addressed, but at the same time through this dissent is actually managed by the state, because as I said, the moment it goes to the court, on the ground nothing much can be done, otherwise there would be contempt of court. And movements are now spending more and more of their energy in the court cases, in the procedural avenues, rather than on the field, on the ground, getting to know what is happening and how things can be changed. The long-term outcomes of judicial activism, PIL, and on-the-ground activities is that Chilika has now become one of the world's largest illegal aquaculture complexes. So if you ever get a chance to visit Chilika, go and visit. You will hardly find a place in Chilika except the smaller area that I showed, because it is deep, and the channel area. Every other place has those shrimp gheris. Judicial activism is there, everything is there at their place, but on the ground things are going on like they have gone on since the past 25 to 30 years. So what we need to understand is that judiciocracy, judicial activism, PILs, social movements, they have their limitations. But when I say they have their limitations, that does not mean that they are completely useless. Rather, they provide avenues for channelizing our grievances, and that is how many a times democracy works, through pushes, through checks and balances. If not for that, then the entire complex of Chilika would be taken over by companies and by the mafia, and the people who had been living off their lives through cultivating or through utilizing the resources of the lake would be completely dispossessed. So we have to understand that nothing is absolute, and in a democracy we need to have an understanding of how different stakeholders work with each other, work against each other, what are the contradictions, what are the possibilities, and that is when we realize that political sociology is not just about giving emphasis to only one or two characters. Rather, we have to look at multiple actors who are part of this system. So these are a few questions for discussion in which you can look at the caste aspect, the blame avoidance aspect, and different other aspects of the case study. And this is my own work. It's available online. If you'd like, you can go through this. Thank you.